The history of the Passover is the video we'll be posting today with the history of the Jews. Really excited about it. Have you ever wondered why the Passover dates change every year and Easter and the Passover dates are so close together? The answer actually lies in astronomy, my favorite subject, by the way, and calendar changes over the centuries. Yet the Passover remains anchored in history and the faith of the Jewish people, and of course, the life of Jesus Christ. To explain this, let's go back thousands of years, even before the time when the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, and before God raised up a leader called Moses, who stood before Pharaoh demanding, "Let my people go." Because the Esther Spa channel was inspired by Queen Esther, who was a Hebrew orphan when the Israelites were exiled in the city of Susa or Shushan in Babylon. So we'll start with Esther. Most of us think she was in Babylon. So we're going to be exploring that and find out where she really was, which is really fun. Through Esther's amazing talents, she was able to win the heart and marry King Ahasuerus, who was king of all Persia, which was then considered to be the Babylon Empire. And by the way, King Ahasuerus was not a pagan. She did not marry outside of the covenant of Israel. He was a descendant from one of the 6 princes who were sons of Abraham with Keturah, his second wife. So we are already beginning to understand certain things that we didn't understand before. So let's continue. Esther was a descendant of Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob. Through Mary, King Ahasuerus, Esther became empress of the whole Babylonian Empire, or the whole Persian Empire, which gave her the power to save the exiled Israelites from being annihilated by the hand of Haman. From here on, we're going to explain this history, how Esther saved her people from being annihilated, and who Haman really was, and why that really happened, and where the hatred began. Pretty interesting. So let's continue. So Haman was the son of Hammedatha, who was a descendant of King Agag. King Agag was the son of Amalek, whose people were the Amalekites. The Amalekites were Edomites, a tribe descendants from Esau. King Agag was Esau, great-grandson, and Esau was the son of Isaac. Isaac was the only son of Abraham with Sarah, to whom God had promised the birthright. Esau, Isaac's son, was Jacob's brother. They were actually twins. Jacob was second, but they were twins, so pretty much equal. As I said, I don't have time to go into all of the history, but you can read this in the Bible. It's all there. But there arose an issue between Esau and Jacob when Esau sold his birthright to his brother Jacob for a pottage meal. Apparently it was some delicious stew and he was very hungry. So he sold his birthright to Jacob for a pot of pottage. And the Amalekites were from Esau lineage. So keep the Amalekites in your mind because we're going to hear a lot about them later. Edom means red, and back then they practiced Epiphany, which means that the place where they lived was called after their leader. And Esau's nickname was Edom, so Edom was located in Negev, which is located in the southern of Israel, which is near Egypt. Very important to remember Negev because we're going to talk some more about that and what happens there. Everything I talk about here really is connected to something that's going to happen later. So keep those names and places in check. The Negev is a big desert area where the city of Beersheba is located and still exists. It is considered to be the capital of Negev today. So that city still exists. If you want to go see it, by all means, come back and let me know what it looks like. There had been periodic conflicts between the Amalekites and the Israelites since the time the Israelites tried to enter the promised land as they were returning from Egypt. The Amalekites were defeated during that time. So much about that later. But skipping a huge amount of history here. Much later, after the reigns of the judges in Israel, after Samson and Delilah, that story that we all know very well, much later in history, Saul was anointed the first king of Israel. Saul was anointed by the prophet Samuel, and this anointment united the tribal government of the tribes of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons. Each one of the 12 sons was one tribe. So that united them into one government instead of each tribe governing themselves. And Saul became the first king over the people of Israel. And that united the tribes into one centralized monarchy. Now, when I say the people of Israel, I'm not speaking about about the country, I'm talking about the people of Israel, meaning that God had given Jacob the name Israel. So the people of Israel, meaning the people of Jacob, and the tribes of Israel, meaning the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. Saul was the son of Kish, who was the son of Abiel. Abiel was the son of Zeror, who was son of Bechorath, who was son of Aphiah, who was son of Shkorim, who was son of Uziel, and Uziel was the son of Bela, who was the son of Benjamin, and Benjamin was the youngest son of Jacob. So Saul came from the lineage of Jacob. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. This history here is so important. If you need to, back up the video and make notes of these names. This is important. We're going to talk about this later. While Saul was king over Israel, another conflict arose between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Remember, the Amalekites are descendants from who? From Esau. And Esau had a problem with Jacob because when he was really hungry, he sold his birthright. And that means Jacob inherited most of the land. And so there was a problem there, especially his descendants. They didn't like that very much. So they had conflicts with the Amalekites on and off quite often. But this time, through the prophet Samuel, God instructed Saul to slay the Amalekites. But this time, it wasn't to slay just the army, it's to slay everyone and everything that belonged to the Amalekites, even their animals. And Saul didn't quite obey that order. So Saul saved the best animals, thinking that maybe he could use some of these best animals to do sacrifices to God. And he also spared King Agag. This disobedience against the prophet's counsel resulted in Samuel the prophet slaying King Agag as God had commanded, and also dethroned Saul because Saul disobeyed the prophet, which is the same as disobeying God because the prophet speaks for God. And also Samuel anointed David, who was a shepherd, to replace King Saul, who at that time also had a mental illness. So there's much about this story. And there's also a really good movie that just came out recently called House of David. I recommend you watch it. There's really good history there too, if you want to see that. Or you can read this story in the Bible, the story of David and Saul, how it all happened. Now, David didn't become king immediately. He respected the king. Back then, the king was only replaced if he died in battle or if he died or somebody would overthrow him. That was not David's intention. He actually liked Saul and even married one of his daughters. David was waiting for his turn to be king. Much later, after Saul died, David became king, and later under King David's grandson, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, the wise king of Israel, son of David. Yes. So Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, grandson of David. During the reign of Rehoboam, the Israelites divided into two groups. One group stayed in the south, and they were the tribe of Judah, the first son of Jacob, and Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob. That group named themselves Judah, and that part of the country was called Judah. And today, that's what we call the Jewish people, Judah, the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. Those people are together, okay? The northern part of the kingdom was called Israel, and that were the other sons. Jacob had 12 sons. 10 of them were in the north, and the south was divided for Judah and Benjamin. And so the northern part was the 10 tribes. And we all have heard that the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes were conquered by the Assyrians, and their people were dispersed and lost in history. And that's why we call them the lost tribes of Israel. There are 10 of them, descendants of 10 sons of Jacob. The southern kingdom, which was called Judah, the tribes of Benjamin and Judah together, Judah was also taken captive into Babylon for 70 years. And they are the people that we refer to as the Jews today, because we know who they are. The other ones we don't, because they are lost. And all of this happened after they had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. We'll talk about this later, so it all makes sense about their captivity in Egypt. So the Jews, the tribes Judah and Benjamin, arrived in Babylon under the reign of King Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. Those people were dispersed all over Persia, but some of them were taken to a city called Susa or Shushan. Susa was one of the Persian capitals during the reign of King Ahasuerus, who is commonly known as King Xerxes. Now, King Ahasuerus reigned from 486 BCE to 465 BCE. His empire was comprised of the whole Persian, the whole Babylon, India, and all that, many provinces. He was a great king, a very powerful king. He was the son of Darius, the emperor of the Achaemenid Empire. The events in the book of Esther in the Bible take place in 483 BC to 473 BC, a 10-year period within the first half of the reign of Ahasuerus, who was also called Xerxes. Don't confuse Ahasuerus with Xerxes the First. Xerxes or Xerxes the First. The king Xerxes the First reigned much later than Ahasuerus, and it's a good idea not to confuse Ahasuerus with Xerxes the First, because those are two different kings. Esther's story is set in Susa or Shushan, in the king's palace, specifically during the third year of the reign of King Ahasuerus, and it is then that we encounter a descendant from King Agag. The king that Samuel killed, Haman, was a descendant from that king. Apparently, at the massacre of the Amalekites, Haman's line survived. There are stories that when Samuel killed the king, his wife was with him and she escaped and was pregnant. The story says that, but I can't verify if this is history or not, so I'm not sure. And this Haman is the Haman who later tries to annihilate the Jews who are now serving King Ahasuerus. Shushan is the biblical name for Susa, the capital of Elam. Elam is in the Persian Empire of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire is one empire, but sometimes they are referred to as separate. So Shushan was located in today's Iran, near the Zagros Mountains in Iran. That's where Shushan was, and that's where Esther lived with the king. Shushan was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC and conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. So Shushan, as mighty and great as it was, fell in the hands of Alexander the Great and was destroyed in 330 before Christ. And this is where the whole story of Esther takes place. This group of Jews that were living in Susa were working for the king. They were serving King Ahasuerus. And Haman the Agagite, or the Amalekite, whose family tradition hated the Jews, obviously, because their people were massacred by King Saul. And Haman and his people were also serving the king. Haman was actually the principal minister and vizier of the court. Now, the vizier was a position of great authority, second only to the king. And he was also vizier in the court, responsible for the administration of justice during the time of King Ahasuerus. Haman was second in command from the king. He had a lot of power, and he hated the Jews, who were now there in exile as captive slaves. So they were serving the king at that time, and Haman did not like that. So Esther was an orphan. Her parents had died when she was 9 years old, and Mordecai, her cousin, had raised her in Shushan. Esther's father was Abicail, son of Shamael, who was son of Jerah, and Jerah was the son of Bela, who was son of Benjamin, and Benjamin was the youngest son of Jacob. Now, Mordecai is Esther's cousin. He was the son of Jair, who was the son of Shimei, the son of Jerah, son of Bela, son of Benjamin, son of Jacob. Now, both Esther and Mordecai were related to King Saul. King Saul was the son of Kish. Kish was the son of Abiel, who was the son of Zeror. Zeror was the son of Bechorath, who was the son of Aphiah. Aphiah was the son of Shkorim, who was son of Uziel. Uziel was the son of Bela, and Bela was the son of Benjamin, son of Jacob. So that's how Mordecai and Esther both were related to King Saul. And guess who Haman, who is this powerful man in the court, really hated, right? He hated King Saul and his descendants, of course. So how does Haman discover that Esther is a Jew? When Esther went to the palace, as we know through her story in the Bible, she was told not to reveal that she was a Jew because of that very problem. Mordecai knew that Haman hated the Jews and that he was very powerful. Esther would be killed if she would reveal that she was a Jew. It wasn't because she was trying to hide her faith or anything, it was just to protect her life. King Ahasuerus had given a feast to the princes who overlooked his provinces, which were many. King Ahasuerus probably wanted to thank these people. So he gave this great feast that lasted months. So he kept having parties for the people that worked for him, for the princes and for the rulers of the provinces. During one of those banquets, the king sent an invitation to his wife, Queen Vashti, to come to the banquet. She refused to come, assuming that the men were drunk because they had feasted for several days. But the king had a quota for the service of wine at the feast, which controlled the drinking. Vashti, not knowing that, refused to come to the banquet, which offended the king before his guests. However, the offense was more than just refusing to accept the invitation for the banquet. She could have gotten out of it if that were all. But a queen at that time meant that she was entrusted with the whole administration of the palace and all the affairs of the king when he left the country, or when he went to war, or when he was absent from the palace. And obviously, the king was preparing for war. He was preparing to go to war against the Greek during that time. Remember, his empire didn't last. It was destroyed by the Greeks. He was having conflicts with the Greeks, and he needed to go to war. And this woman needed to be in his place. Who knows? He could have been killed. It was her responsibility to take care of the palace and the affairs of the whole empire in his absence. So a queen who would refuse coming before the king at his banquet was making a statement that she would not obey his orders or take care of his administration affairs when he departed to war. And Vashti had done that before all the princes in charge of the king's provinces, which could cause a serious problem, even an invasion in the absence of the king. And he was about to depart to war, which was really serious. So Vashti's disobedience was an act of open rebellion against the king and against the crown in front of those that the king ruled, the princes of Persia and all the princes that ruled the provinces for him. It was not declining an invitation to dinner. It was declining her responsibilities with the crown, not wanting to meet with the people the king was doing business with. It was like telling them, hey, we can go against the king. Vashti's disobedience was much more serious than just not coming to the banquet to show her beauty. It was more than that. So this called the king to confer with his assistants, and the decision was made that Vashti was not fit to be queen of the empire, because the queen had to protect the empire in the absence of the king. She had made a fool out of the king and made a statement that she wasn't going to take care of anything in his absence. And her act had caused disrespect towards her. Now, those princes would not respect her as the commander-in-chief in the absence of the king, after she wouldn't even meet with them. Her act was disrespect towards her position of authority before all the princes of Persia, an act of betrayal against the crown by not attending that banquet willingly. We have all these stories about them being drunk and that she was going to show her beauty and she didn't want to be before the drunken people. There was no such thing. There was a quota of how much the people could drink. The king would not allow that to happen in his court. And so that wasn't really the reason why she didn't come. She didn't come because she was already committing treason against the crown. So Vashti was deposed, and the king was left in a situation where he had to find another wife. And he needed to find one that they could train and teach the protocols and administration of the palace and all of the affairs of the king. Now, this was a huge, humongous job, because the king was king over all of Babylon, all of Persia, which included India, included all of that area, which is humongous. And that administration was going to be in the queen's hand. And she needed to know how to do that. She had to be a person that could stand before princes, governors, and rulers, and his advisors and assistants. She was to be a great queen over all his empire, not just somebody to wear jewelry and jump in bed with him. That's not what the whole thing was about. This new queen needed to be trained. As you read in the Bible, there was no force. As we see in the movies, nobody was breaking down doors coming to get Esther. She was to prepare, and the most well-prepared would be chosen to be a contestant. So it wasn't even being chosen to be queen yet. She was being chosen to be a contestant among all of the other young ladies. Now, Mordecai, having known how well-educated Esther was, and that she came from the line of King Saul, therefore she was from the line of royalty, and she would be in a position of becoming queen and be able to intercede for the Jews Jews as queen, because by that time, Haman was making life miserable for the Jews. She was instructed not to say who she was. He instructed her to call herself Esther. And so Esther was taken to the palace, and she was in the palace studying and preparing with the other young ladies, contestants for the crown. They were preparing for an opportunity to meet the king, to be tested, to see if they were really capable physically, mentally, and health-wise to be queen. There were lots of things then. The myrrh, the frankincense, the balms were for health. Health equates beauty. A healthy person is also beautiful. So that, of course, made them beautiful. But it was more for purification. They had to go through this period of purification before they could even meet the king. But why? It wasn't like, oh, let's be pretty and purify our bodies so we can jump in bed with the king. It wasn't that. This king had tremendous work. He was an extremely busy person. He was king in an empire that was humongous, and he could not afford catching colds or catching viruses. And these girls were from regular walks of life. They needed to go through a period of purification before they could come before him. One of them was going to be his wife, so she couldn't contaminate him. He didn't know what they had, if they were sick or not, capable physically and mentally and health-wise to take care of the kingdom and the palace. And they needed to learn about palace administration and the tremendous amount of people that always came in and out of the palace, what the protocols were for that, and how to feed those people, what to feed, what to order, and take care of the administration of the palace kitchen, which was obviously immensely big, and the management of all the affairs of the palace. Plus, they needed to learn the administration of the kingdom so that one that would be queen could rule in the absence of the king. There was a real education there, and it wasn't just to look pretty so she could sleep with the king. It was way more than that. In fact, there was no sleeping until she was actually made a queen, wife of the king. So Esther, being as brilliant as she was and also pretty, she was very obedient to the protocols and the teachings. She learned it all and eventually was chosen to be the queen and wife of King Ahasuerus. Not only that, but he also loved her. He fell in love with her. Now, but here's a problem. Haman works in the court. Haman knew that Mordecai was a Jew and that he was a descendant of King Saul, and he hated Mordecai. But Mordecai was a scribe in the palace, and Haman was having a hard time getting rid of Mordecai. So he would come up with all these stratagems because he was in charge of the laws in the administration of the palace. He and the king had to obey the laws too. So he was trying to figure out a way he could get rid of Mordecai and also get rid of these Jews that he hated through a law. So eventually, because the king had this protocol that people bow to him and to those who were higher in his court, and Mordecai wasn't bowing to anybody because he was a Jew and didn't bow to anybody but God. So he didn't bow to Haman, and Haman was pretty upset with that, especially the way he felt about the Jews. Eventually, this hate of Haman towards Mordecai escalated, and this caused Haman, in his high position of authority, to blame the Jews for insubordination. So he concocted all kinds of stories against the Jews, saying that they could rise up against the king because they were kneeling and bowing to the authorities of the kingdom. They could stop paying their taxes to the king, and just came to where finally the king agreed to allow Haman to pass a decree to exterminate the Jews, kill all of them. Now, when Esther discovered this plot, she sent word to her people to fast for 3 days with her, and after 3 days she would go before the king and petition for their life. And the word went out to a lot of places, and they fasted, and Esther went before the king 3 times. Each time she invited the king to a banquet, and the king would come. For the 3rd time, she revealed to the king that she was a Jew and that Haman was about to kill her and her people because obviously she was a Jew and she would be among those who would be killed. So the king was very angry with Haman because, of course, he loved Esther. And this decree that Haman did was with the authority of the king, by the king's signet ring that was used back then to sign decrees, and the king could not revoke it. And so the king was very upset because he discovered that his wife was a Jew and that she is going to be killed with her people because he could not revoke the law that was passed with his ring. So the king arrested Haman, and in the process, he also discovered that Haman had built a very high gallows to hang Mordecai for not bowing to him, and discovered that Mordecai was Esther's cousin. So immediately the king ordered the execution of Haman and actually executed Haman in the gallows that he had built to execute Mordecai. Mordecai. Not only the king executed him, but executed him, his wife, his children, and all those related to him and his household. Got rid of all the conspiracy. Mordecai had been faithful and saved the king's life from some plot to poison him. You can read that also in the Bible. The king knew all of that about Mordecai. The king also admired and respected and loved Mordecai. And now he knew that his wife and Mordecai were cousins and that they were about to be killed. The king's law could not be revoked in any way or shape. So there was no way Esther or Mordecai could have revoked that decree. However, with authority, they could decree that the Jews could defend themselves. And as we know in history, every time the Jews defended themselves, they won because they had the power of God with them. The killing of the Jews wasn't going to be just in Susa or Shushan. It was all through the empire. And so Esther and Mordecai sent a decree throughout the empire that all Jews could pray and defend themselves. So they defended themselves and they won. And the date was the 13th day of the month of Adar. It was one day battle only. The next day, none of the Jews had been killed. They were protected by God and saved. And Mordecai continued to serve the king in the palace in Shushan. And Esther declared a day of feast in celebration of the people's freedom from oppression from Haman. She called that day the Day of Purim, referring to Pur, a game of lot that Haman used and cast to determine the day he would exterminate the Jews. And the lot fell on the 13th of the month of Adar. Today, Purim is still celebrated among the Jews to celebrate how God saved them from annihilation in the Persian Empire. And it is important that we recognize that we are here today because Esther saved the Jews that day. All people who are descendants of the Jews are here today because Esther saved them that day. Remember, the other 10 tribes, they are lost. We don't know who they are. But the Jews, the tribe of Benjamin and Judah, we know who they are and how Esther saved them. That freedom and being saved was equal to a Passover. When we hear about the Jewish people celebrating Purim, that's what it means. It means the day they celebrate being saved by God, by a miracle, because of Esther. If you like this content, subscribe and share the Esther Spot channel. And we'll continue with the history of the Passover. Now, what does the story of Esther have to do with the Passover? You're probably wondering, right? Okay, the story of Esther was told here to demonstrate how the Jewish people have been in some kind of bondage all their existence. But every time God has saved them from extermination. Isn't that wonderful? Every time God has saved them and actually released them from bondage. The story of Esther is significant because even after having been slaves in Egypt for 400 years, the people eventually got themselves in bondage again for another 70 years. They returned eventually. King Xerxes the first released them. Many years again, the whole nation was overrun and scattered through all the face of the earth. The Jewish nation, or Judah, the country of Judah, was disbanded, and the Jewish people from that descendancy, which is Judah and Benjamin, were without a country for 2,000 years, and they did not return to Israel, as Israel was not made a state for the Jews to return to until the state of Israel was restored as a nation again and was proclaimed as a nation on May 14, 1948. There's a lot of history I can't go into here. There's no way to tell this whole history in one video. So this declaration on May 14, 1948 took place in Tel Aviv by David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was the chairman of the Jewish Agency of Israel. So why is the story of the Passover with the story of Esther? If it were not for Esther, the people of Judah and Benjamin, or the Jewish people, would have been annihilated, and King Cyrus the Great would not have allowed the Jews to return. There was King Cyrus the Great that actually wrote a decree allowing the Jews to return from Susa and from the other area they were being captive in Babylon and return from exile to Jerusalem in 539 BCE. King Cyrus the Great gave them that freedom so they could rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This event is written in the book of Ezra and Second Chronicles in the Bible. And this was way after they had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. So at one point or another, the Jewish people have been in bondage, as Egyptians, the slaves. And even now, nations are still trying to conquer them. And now let's continue with the history of the Passover. So I have had some people ask, do I need to be a Jew to celebrate the Passover? Or they ask about the Passover Seder, what it is. Some things are very cultural among the Jews, and sometimes people who don't practice Judaism or they haven't really paid attention to the history of the Jews, they don't know. And so they want to know if they can or cannot participate and celebrate the Passover, which is wonderful that people are interested in that. And yes, you can celebrate the Passover regardless of your religion. It doesn't matter what religion you are, you can celebrate the Passover. But it is a sacred holiday for both the Christians and the Jews. And it should be celebrated with respect because of its sacred nature. The Passover week begins at sundown on Saturday. Saturday is the Jewish Sabbath or Jewish Sunday. And it ends at sundown on the following Saturday. From Saturday to Saturday is the Jewish week. So sundown on Saturday is the celebration with the Seder, which is the famous dinner that everybody is curious about. And so the Seder is a feast. It's a family and friends get together for this celebration. And it is a ritual dinner, actually, with some rituals performed during that time. Very beautiful prayers and things that they do that reminds them of who they are and the things that they have gone through that we're going to be talking about soon here towards the end of this video, okay? So the Christians call the Passover week Holy Week. So when you hear somebody is talking about the Holy Week, they're talking about the Passover week. And the Passover day is called Easter in the Christian religion. Easter is also celebrated with a dinner as well, with activities and fun for children. And since we are speaking of true history, we might as well speak of a truth here that is important. It is fitting to mention that the Easter bunny and the colorful Easter eggs are not connected with the sacred meaning of the Passover, nor is it connected with the meaning of Easter at all. It is just a tradition. The Easter bunny and the Easter egg was a tradition first introduced into American culture by German immigrants. And it was a celebration of the beginning of the spring season, but it shares no meaning and no history with a Passover or with Easter. It's only a tradition. It's important that you know that. But it's a fun tradition. People like it. What is the difference between the Passover and Easter? The Passover commemorates the events described in the Old Testament in the Bible that lead to the freedom of the Jews from bondage in Egypt. So we started with the story of Esther, which happened way after Egypt, right? And now we're going to be talking about what happened in Egypt and what really brought the Passover and how the Passover is very similar to all these other events that happened. And without Esther, we would not have Easter. We will talk about that in just a minute. The Passover is a celebration of freedom, but it's a freedom never to be forgotten. Easter week or Holy Week, on the other hand, commemorates the events described in the Bible in the New Testament that led to Jesus Christ's atonement for our sins in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was betrayed by Judas. One of the apostles was arrested and tried by King Herod, the governor of the Jews at that time. This Easter remembrance includes the people's decision to crucify Jesus, his carrying the cross to the hill Golgotha, where he was crucified, and his death on the cross, his burial, and finally his rising from the dead at the third day, and his ascension to heaven as a perfect resurrected being. That's what we celebrate during Easter. Why does the Passover and Easter not fall on the same week or day in April? Why different dates? The Passover and Easter holiday dates vary annually because the Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar based on the phases of the moon and Earth's orbit around the sun. Thus, the Jewish calendar aligns with the seasons of the year, adding a leap day periodically. The Jewish year begins with the feast of Rosh Hashanah, meaning head of the year, or New Year, with the feast of the trumpets. The Rosh Hashanah is designated AM or Anno Mundi, year of the world, and that new year does not fall on our new year because it's a different calendar. The dates are calculated differently. Also on the Jewish calendar, the leap year has an extra month, Adar 1, and that Adar 1 month is added before the normal month of Adar. That's why their dates do not coincide with ours. Furthermore, our global calendar, the calendar we use, is the Gregorian calendar. It is based on the solar calendar only. It divides the year into 12 months, with each month having a different number of days. A solar calendar is based on the Earth's orbit around the sun sun and tracks the progression of our seasons. This means our solar calendar contains 365 days plus one extra day every 4 years, called leap year. This is the most widely used calendar, and it is called the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar was introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. It was introduced to correct the discrepancy on the Julian calendar. The correction was done by adding a leap year to adjust the calendar with Earth's orbit around the sun. The Julian calendar was, of course, a Roman calendar organized by Julius Caesar. Introduced in Rome in 46 before Christ as a reform of the old Roman calendar. The Julius calendar became popular in 45 BC and was widely used in the conquered Roman Empire and by most of the Western world for over 1,600 years, until it was replaced by the Gregorian calendar in 1582. So why do the Passover dates vary, even though the Passover is based on a Jewish calendar? Over the centuries, the calendar adjustments and new calendars did not affect how the Jews used their calendar, which is based on the Earth and Sun orbit and Moon's phases. And that does not exactly match our present Gregorian calendar, but it is pretty close. And this results in the Passover and Easter sometimes occurring in March and sometimes in April, with the dates varying as well. So anyone can celebrate the Passover according to the dates that those holidays fall into. If you are celebrating Holy Week or the Easter dinner, it is very important to keep in mind that those are not random holiday occasions. The Passover and Easter season are the same as far as importance and sacredness because of the events that transpired anciently and in the Meridian time, honoring the miracle experienced by the people of Israel during their final days as slaves in Egypt. The Passover celebrates their deliverance from 400 years of slavery, the wonders, the miracles that they witnessed that led to their liberty, and most specifically, the miracle of crossing the Red Sea on dry ground. The crossing of the Red Sea on dry ground, their passing over from oppression to liberty, is what gives the Passover its name and sacred meaning. While Jewish families honor this sacred history with a Seder, Christians do not ignore this event either, but they also celebrate Easter on Sunday, a day that is filled with joy and reverence, just as the Passover is filled with joy and reverence. Easter is a celebration of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice for our sins, his crucifixion, and the resurrection. Both seasons remind us of God's promise of deliverance being fulfilled and his love for us. The story of the Passover week, the Holy Week, and Easter has been told and retold for generations, and it is still well celebrated. Most of us know this story well. However, the story of the Passover is still a little bit confusing for those who don't know the history of the Jews and why the Passover is so important to them. It is important that we understand that history and that we respect the love the Jews have for the Passover. Because without the Passover, without the Jews being freed from slavery in Egypt, there would have been no prophets of old, no Esther, saving of the Jews in Babylon, and no king, no story of the king, King Ahasuerus, no Samson and Delilah, no David and Goliath, no Star of David, no wise King Solomon and the temple, and consequently, no Joseph and Mary, no Christmas, and no Jesus Christ, the Savior and Redeemer and Messiah. Without the Passover, there would have been no atonement for our sins and no resurrection of the dead. Thus, it is imperative that we know the history of the Passover well and recognize its significance and importance, because every event of the Passover in the ancient days of the Israelites points to Jesus Christ, the much-awaited Messiah. With this knowledge about this holy holiday, we can help heal misunderstandings and eradicate prejudice against the Jews. Now, if you think that this content has been useful to you and informative, subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends. So, what is the Passover really? Let's find out about the history of the Jews before this event occurred. What happened that caused this holiday to be celebrated with such passion? And why is the Passover so important to the Jews? And why should the Passover be equally as important to Christians? Knowledge is power. Let's explore a brief Hebrew history to clarify the enigma behind these questions. Let's go back in history a little bit, beginning with Joseph. Joseph was one of Jacob's younger sons who was hated by his brothers and who was sold as a slave into Egypt. In fact, you remember Benjamin, the son of Jacob, from whom Queen Esther, King Saul, and Mordecai were related. Joseph was a brother of Benjamin. He was born to Rachel and Jacob. Rachel was one of the wives of Jacob and was the wife that originally Jacob had intended to marry, but by a trick by his father-in-law, he ended up bearing two sisters. And so there was a lot of friction over there. One of the frictions against Joseph was that his brothers thought that his father loved him more because he was one of the two only sons of Rachel, who was the wife originally chosen by Jacob. But it was just an impression that they had. So here is a brief summary of the story of Joseph's life. Bear with me, because to understand this story, I must talk about topics that you may think are unrelated, but that are connected to the whole history of the Passover. Keep in mind that for the sake of time, it is impossible to give you all of the details concerning the history of the Jews and concerning the history of the Passover, and concerning the history of Esther, concerning the history of Mordecai, and concerning the history of King Saul, and concerning the history of how the Passover came about and Easter and all that. And definitely, there is no time to tell you all the details concerning the life of Joseph. But the life of Joseph is definitely connected with the Passover, so it's a good thing to learn about him. But the story is available in the Bible and other ancient texts containing the history of the Jews. As a teenager, Joseph was very smart, very handsome, and very obedient to God and to his father Jacob. So he was favored. He was an obedient child in every way. His older brothers, however, weren't quite as faithful, and Joseph was very blessed, and they hated him. Besides, he being the son of Rachel, who Jacob had originally chosen as his first wife, that ended up being his last wife. So Joseph became even more hated by his brothers when he had a dream that predicted he would rule over them. To make matters worse, Jacob made Joseph a coat of many colors. In those days, colors were symbols of status and royalty, and Joseph's coat was made of not only one color, but many colors. That infuriated his brothers, who thought that their father Jacob loved Joseph more than he loved them. What inspired Jacob to make this coat of many colors for Joseph is unknown. We don't know what inspired Jacob to do this. At least I don't know. There may be history there that tells us, but I haven't found it yet. So Joseph, being much younger than his brothers and very smart, but not wise in dealing with his older brothers, he gave a bad report of his brothers to his father Jacob. And when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were tending sheep in the field, the brothers planned to kill him. However, Reuben, one of the brothers, did not agree with that plan and intervened. He suggested that the brothers throw Joseph in a pit instead. Judah really liked that plan and suggested that they throw Joseph in a pit and then sell him to avoid committing murder against their own brother. Judah was the oldest brother, son of the first wife, who was Rachel's sister. Reuben's intention, however, was different. Reuben's intention was to rescue Joseph from the pit and take him back to his father. But before Reuben could return to the pit to extract Joseph, a group of Midianites, merchants from the land of Midia, found Joseph in the pit and brought him out. The Midianites were descendants from Midian. Midian was one of the 6 sons of Abraham with Keturah, his second wife, after his first wife Sarah died. In ancient times, eponymy was practiced, which means if somebody moved with their family somewhere, were descendants of the leader of that family, the leader of that tribe, the leader of that clan, would name the land after that leader's name. So the land of Midian was named after Midian, who was the son of Abraham. Therefore, the Midianites were descendants of Midian. Now, the Ishmaelites were descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael was one of the sons of Abraham with a woman named Hagar. Hagar was Abraham's wife Sarah's maid or servant. And Sarah had given that maid to Abraham as a concubine. As I said, there's a lot of history here and details in the story that I can't go into, but you can read this in the Bible. Now, Hagar was not a slave, as it is believed. She was from Egypt, and she was Sarah's maid maid in Abraham's household. Now keep in mind, she's from Egypt. Soon we're going to talk about some places near Egypt and the people near Egypt. Keep that in mind. So Hagar was not a slave, and she was from Egypt, and she was a maid in Abraham's household. And then she was given to him as one of his concubines, or one of his wives, second wives. Hagar was not in chattel servitude. She was not forced slave. That's what it means, which means she served under a contract of that day. That agreement could be for life or could end, such as with a marriage, depending on the arrangement. It could end as well. It did not mean that people would serve for life as slaves. They were servants, not slaves. Some of the servants usually stayed with their masters for life or temporarily, depending on the arrangement. Hagar eventually broke her promise or broke her contract with her mistress Sarah, which led for conflict between her and Sarah. At first, Hagar ran away, but she was found by an angel near a spring of water in a desert. The desert was near the road to a city called Shur, which was near the northern border of Egypt. Remember, she was Egyptian. She was probably trying to get to Egypt. That's where the angel found her, near a spring of water in a desert near the road to the city of Shur, which was near Egypt, which was near the northern border of Egypt. The angel instructed Hagar to return to Sarah. Hagar returned, but the problem between her and Sarah continued to escalate, more so after Sarah's son Isaac was born. Eventually, Sarah demanded that Abraham took Hagar and her son Ishmael to Beersheba. Beersheba was a city in the south of the Negev desert, and that city too was close to the Egyptian border, and Hagar was Egyptian. Abraham took his son and Hagar to Beersheba near Egypt. These people are the Ishmaelites. The Midianites met a caravan of Ishmaelites, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. When the Ishmaelites met with the Midianites and bought Joseph, they were coming from Gilead and were headed to Egypt to sell spices, balm, and myrrh in Egypt. This is the same balm of Gilead that is mentioned in several passages in the Bible. Balm of Gilead came from this place called Gilead, and the Ishmaelites were the ones that sold it. So the Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Remember, they got Joseph from the pit, not from the brothers. They got Joseph from the pit, sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, which is equivalent to $336 in today's silver value. Now, let's clarify something very important about Hagar and her status in Abraham's household. And to do this, we must understand the following passage in the Bible, okay? In the book of Genesis, in the Bible, on chapter 17, verse 13, God said this to Abraham, quote, "He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant." This passage of scripture does not specify whether bought with thy money meant that Abraham bought slaves' freedoms with his money and employed them as servants in his household, or if he bought slaves and kept them as slaves. It does not say that Abraham had slaves. Nonetheless, there is not any verse in the Bible that says that Abraham had slaves or kept slaves in his household. It only says, "He that is bought with thy money." And since the matter is not clear, I assume that it is best not to claim that Abraham had anything to do with slave trafficking. Furthermore, Hagar is mentioned several times in Genesis chapter 16 as maid and maidservant. There's nothing written that says Hagar was a slave in Abraham's household. The Bible acknowledges the presence of servitude in Abraham's household as servants, and he calls them his servants. It does not provide details about the nature of the servitude. Now, considering Abraham's faithfulness to God, a God who opposes slavery and even freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, it is reasonable to consider that Abraham treated his servants justly and incorporated them into his family through the covenant of circumcision, which made his servants part of his eternal family, and therefore they were not slaves. Now back to the transaction of the Midianites and the Ishmaelites. Obviously, the Midianites and the Ishmaelites were not the same people, but they were cousins. And here's how they're cousins. They were descended from two different sons of Abraham, Midian and Ishmael. Midian from Keturah, the wife he married after Sarah died. Ishmael was the son of Hagar, who Sarah Sarah had given to be a concubine to Abraham. So the Midianites and the Ishmaelites were descended from Midian and Ishmael, who were both sons of Abraham. During that time of that slave transaction, when Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites, those people had already become corrupt and had vastly deviated from the teachings of Abraham. And Joseph's brothers had deviated from their father's teachings. So at that time, the people were churning wicked, and slave trafficking had gotten a hold of their heart, even Abraham's descendants. Now, the Midianites never bought Joseph from anybody. They got Joseph from the pit on their own. They never struck any deal with Joseph's brothers. They had gotten Joseph for free from the pit, and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And that deal was done without the knowledge of any of Joseph's brothers, although they had planned to sell him. And Joseph was extracted from the pit before Reuben, one of his brothers, could return to the pit to rescue him as he had originally intended. You can read this entire story in the King James Bible in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 20 through 33, or in any of the Bibles. In those verses, neither the Ishmaelites or the Midianites knew about the brothers' intention to sell Joseph. After buying Joseph from the Midianites, the Ishmaelites came to Egypt. They were headed to Egypt, so they came to Egypt. And they sold Joseph to Potiphar, who was Pharaoh's officer, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. As most of us know, Joseph was very handsome, very intelligent, and very diligent. He prospered in Potiphar's household, and he managed his household until Potiphar's wife got a crush on him and tried to seduce him. In the seduction attempt, Joseph ran from her, but left a piece of garment behind. And with that piece of garment, she accused Joseph of attempting to rape her. And Joseph was thrown in jail. Joseph exceeded in the jail cell also. That's also in the scriptures. He was very good at interpreting dreams. So eventually, he was asked to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh's butler and the baker, who were put in jail together with Joseph. Joseph interpreted their dreams, and the dreams came true. The butler was restored to Pharaoh's palace, but the baker was put to death, as Joseph had interpreted in the dream. Later, Pharaoh had some dreams, and none of his wise men could interpret those dreams. But the butler remembered that Joseph had interpreted his dreams, and he told Pharaoh. And in turn, Pharaoh summoned Joseph to interpret the dreams that he had. Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and in the process, he won Pharaoh's trust. And Pharaoh made Joseph a ruler in Egypt, second only to himself. Pharaoh also gave Joseph a wife. Her name was Asenath. Asenath was the adopted daughter of Potiphar. Potiphar was the priest of On in Heliopolis in Egypt. Now, Potiphar was the captain of the guard, and Potiphar was the priest of On. Potiphar and Potiphar were two different people who lived in different parts of Egypt. Now, Asenath was not Egyptian, as it is always assumed. She was also Hebrew. Asenath was the daughter of Dinah, born from that rape by Shechem, the prince of the city of Shechem in Canaan. Joseph was very young when Dinah gave birth to Asenath, but he knew what had happened, and he had seen Dinah's baby. Now, how did Potiphar and his wife adopt Asenath? Potiphar and his wife could not have children. When Jacob saw that his daughter Dinah had become pregnant, Jacob counseled Dinah to place the baby for adoption. After the baby was born, Dinah traveled as a helper in a caravan to Egypt. She took the baby with her, and she left the baby at Potiphar's palace gate. Potiphar found the child and took her to his wife to raise her as their own daughter. Soon Potiphar found Dinah crying by the gate, where she revealed to Potiphar that she was the mother of the child, and the child was Hebrew. But Asenath was raised as an Egyptian, as Potiphar's only child. Later, when Asenath met Joseph, and through a series of miracles, she was converted to Joseph's faith. So Joseph did not marry an Egyptian. He married his cousin, Dinah's daughter, who was only a few years younger than him. And yes, although Asenath was Hebrew, like Moses, she was also raised in the customs of the Egyptians and worshipped the gods of Egypt. But she was converted to his faith before they were married. Now, how did the people of Israel end up in Egypt? In the process of interpreting Pharaoh's dream, Joseph saw a famine coming to Egypt. And Joseph instructed Pharaoh to store grain for 7 years before the 7 years of famine started. And so the famine began as Joseph had predicted. Jacob's family in Canaan was afflicted by the famine, and his brothers came to purchase grain in Egypt. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dream he had as a young man that revealed he would rule over his brother. And knowing his brother's skills in the art of war, he thought that they were in Egypt to spy and placed them under guard to be watched. Even at that point, Joseph did not know that his brothers had intentions of selling him. Joseph knew his brothers had tried to kill him by throwing him in a pit, but that was it. That's all he knew. It was while the brothers were being detained that Joseph overheard a conversation between them in which they blamed each other for having tried to kill Joseph and plotting to sell him. So at that moment, Joseph thought that his brothers had sold him to the Midianites, which led him to be sold to Potiphar. It was one misunderstanding upon another. However, at that point, the brothers thought Joseph was dead and his death was their fault and the reason they were arrested and afflicted, and that this man was going to kill them. After that, Joseph was only concerned that they were spying on Egypt's wealth, perhaps to return to Canaan and come back with an army to attack Egypt. That's all Joseph was concerned. Joseph knew the strength of the Israelites in the battlefield, and being a ruler in Egypt, his duty was to protect Egypt and Pharaoh, who he at that time already considered as a father. You can verify this conversation in the book of Genesis, chapter 42, verses 21 through 23 in the Bible. Joseph tested his brothers in very stressful ways. First, by keeping Simeon as hostage until the brothers brought Benjamin to him. Joseph feared that the brothers may have killed Benjamin because he and Benjamin were brothers. They were sons of the wife that was beloved Jacob. Only after they brought Benjamin unharmed to him that Joseph revealed who he was. And then he kept Benjamin and sent the brothers back to Canaan to bring his father Jacob and his household to him in Egypt to escape the famine. Joseph's brothers were experts at raising sheep and cattle and became shepherds for Pharaoh's herd. They were also given the land of Goshen to live, where they could care for Pharaoh's sheep and cattle. The people of Israel, Joseph's family, lived in Egypt many years under the protection of Joseph. But eventually the Pharaoh, who was like a father to Joseph, died, and Joseph became the king or Pharaoh over all the land of Egypt, fulfilling Joseph's dream that he would rule over his brothers. But eventually Joseph died, and another Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph's method of administration or respected Joseph's leadership and faith, came to rule Egypt, and through stratagem enslaved the Israelites into chattel servitude. And that is how the Israelites became slaves in Egypt and were there in bondage for 400 years. This history helps us to understand the significance of the Passover. And the question is there more to this story? Yes, there's a lot more to this story, but we're not going to tell that here. To understand it all, I suggest that you read chapters 30 through 50 of the book of Genesis in the Bible, chapters 1 through 15 in the book of Exodus, the history of the Jews in Josephus, and the book of Jasher, and other historical records or books that you may read the ancient history of the Jews. But before you read any of these scriptures or records, you need to remove from your mind movies that you may have seen before you read about the Israelites and the story of Joseph and also the story of Esther. Those movies are very good. They give a lot of history, but they're very short and they don't give the details. And a lot of things are misinterpreted as well. So when you read the story of Joseph and the story of Esther in the scriptures, pay close attention to the words, and you will see the story of Abraham's family, the story of the family of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Jacob, the story of the family of Jacob and his sons, which is the story of the 12 tribes of Israel. Read and you will see how it unfolds, how it is all connected and brought to pass the Passover. So the origins of the Passover and its significance. The Passover is a true story that eventually brings us to Jesus Christ and to Easter. It begins with Moses repeatedly asking Pharaoh to allow the Israelites a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifice to God. And this was after they had been slaves for 400 years. They needed a few days off to go serve their God. You can read the full story of Moses in the book of Exodus in the Bible. Bible. Okay, Moses was a Hebrew child who was miraculously saved and raised by Pharaoh's daughter, a history that you must read in the Bible as well. The events of the Passover begins with Moses petitioning Pharaoh many times to allow the people of Israel 3 days to go into the desert to make sacrifices unto the Lord. Pharaoh refuses Moses' request each time, which finally led God to sending 10 plagues upon Egypt, starting with the Nile turning into blood and culminating into the death of every firstborn in Egypt, including the firstborn of animals and Pharaoh's firstborn. To protect the Israelites during the final plague, God instructed them to mark their doorposts with lamb's blood, so the angel of death would pass over their homes and not kill their firstborn. This event led Pharaoh to release the Israelites, though he soon repented and pursued them, which led to their miraculous crossing the Red Sea on dry ground. The duration between each plague is not specified, but the entire sequence was approximately 40 days. So the Passover observance commemorates the Israelites' liberation from Egypt. As commanded in Exodus 13, verse 5 through 8, the Jews observe this event every year, the Passover week, for 7 days by eating unleavened bread or matzah and by telling the Exodus story to their children. The matzah is made without yeast and baked within 18 minutes from start to finish, symbolizing the haste of the Israelites' departure from Egypt. The central tradition of the Passover is the Passover Seder, which is a ritual meal featuring a Seder plate with symbolic foods. The zeroah or shank bone represents the Passover sacrifice. They had to kill some lambs so they could put the blood on their doorposts so their firstborn could be saved from being killed by the angel of death. So on the plate, there will be a shank bone or a little piece of roasted lamb. On the plate also there will be a beitzah or roasted egg, which symbolizes their mourning and also the cycle of life in Egypt and the beginning of their life at the promised land. The charo is a sweet mixture of apples and dates, representing the mortar used by the slaves to make bricks for Pharaoh. The karpas, which is parsley, is dipped in salt water to symbolize the tears of the slaves. The chazeret, an additional bitter herb, is often on the plate as a romaine lettuce, represents the harshness and the hardships the slaves endured in Egypt. Christians view the Last Supper, which was Jesus' final meal with his 12 disciples, with the same reverence as they view the Passover. The Last Supper was held before Jesus' crucifixion on Good Friday, and of course before his resurrection on Easter Sunday. Jesus was the sacrificial lamb. If you like, just subscribe and share and comment below. Thank you for watching Esther Spa.